It was meant to be a day of family, laughter, and delicious grilled fare, a classic backyard barbecue to celebrate the start of summer. But for the Wilson family, their peaceful gathering was about to be shattered by an unwelcome visitor with an agenda fueled by prejudice and a burning desire to keep his neighborhood the way he liked it. As the sounds of sizzling burgers and playful children's laughter filled the air, the Wilsons never could have imagined the firestorm that was about to erupt. Their next-door neighbor, a cantankerous older man named Mr. Hollister, had been eyeing the family's festivities with thinly veiled disdain from his kitchen window. He had always viewed the Wilsons as interlopers, an intrusion into the carefully manicured, all-white landscape he had grown accustomed to over the decades. But today, Mr. Hollister's discomfort would boil over into outright confrontation. Marching across the neatly trimmed lawn, his face flushed with barely contained fury, he stormed up to the Wilson family's gate, ready to unleash a torrent of bigoted vitriol. "This is a respectable neighborhood," he spat, "and I won't have you people turning it into some sort of circus." The Wilsons, taken aback by the neighbor's sudden and hostile outburst, scrambled to defuse the situation. Father William, a man of quiet dignity and unwavering principles, stepped forward, his voice calm yet firm. "Mr. Hollister, this is a private gathering on our own property. We're simply enjoying a summer afternoon with our family. I don't see how that's any of your concern." But Mr. Hollister was not to be dissuaded. His beady eyes narrowed as he unleashed a barrage of hateful slurs, painting the Wilsons as unwanted interlopers who had no place in his community. The children, sensing the tension, grew quiet and fearful, clinging to their parents' sides. Just when it seemed the confrontation would descend into an all-out brawl, something unexpected happened. William Wilson, the family patriarch, slowly reached into the pocket of his well-worn apron, producing a small, weathered photograph. With a heavy sigh, he extended it to the fuming Mr. Hollister, a solemn expression on his face. "You know, Mr. Hollister," William began, his voice tinged with a hint of sadness, "this neighborhood hasn't always been the way you remember it." As the older man's brow furrowed in confusion, William continued, "Back in the day, this used to be a much more diverse community. People of all backgrounds lived and worked side by side, getting along just fine." Gripping the photograph, Mr. Hollister's expression gradually shifted from one of rage to something akin to bewilderment. What secrets did this image hold, and how could they possibly change the course of this confrontation? The tension in the air was palpable as the Wilsons waited with bated breath, wondering how their neighbor would react to this unexpected revelation. Mr. Hollister's weathered hands trembled slightly as he studied the faded photograph William Wilson had entrusted to him. The image depicted a bustling neighborhood street, lined with a mix of homes and businesses, a far cry from the homogeneous, mostly white enclave he had grown accustomed to over the years. Squinting his eyes, he could make out a group of people standing together, smiling and chatting amicably. There in the center of the frame was a family that looked remarkably similar to the Wilsons. "This," Mr. Hollister's voice trailed off, his brow furrowing as a lifetime of assumptions and preconceptions suddenly came into question. William Wilson watched the older man's reaction closely, sensing the wheels turning in his mind. That photograph was taken back in the 1960s, not long before the neighborhood started to change. He paused, gauging Mr. Hollister's response. "You see, Mr. Hollister, this community used to be much more diverse, a melting pot, if you will, where people of all backgrounds lived and worked side by side." The air was thick with tension as Mr. Hollister remained silent, his gaze fixed on the image. The Wilson family, sensing a potential shift in the situation, held their breath, hoping that William's words had struck a chord within their stubborn neighbor. Finally, Mr. Hollister looked up, his features softening ever so slightly. I remember those days," he murmured, his voice tinged with a hint of nostalgia. "Back then, it wasn't just white folks living here. There were African Americans, Hispanics, even a few Asian families." He paused, his eyes growing distant. "We all got along well enough, I suppose, didn't cause too much fuss." William nodded, sensing an opening. "That's right. This neighborhood was a place where people of different backgrounds could live and work together, supporting one another." He gestured toward the Wilsons, a warm smile on his face, just like our family here. We're proud to be a part of this community, Mr. Hollister, and we'd love for you to be a part of it too. The older man's brow furrowed, and for a moment it seemed as though he might revert to his previous hostility. But something in William's words had struck a chord, and the tension in the air began to dissipate, if only slightly. I don't know what happened, to be honest," Mr. Hollister confessed, his gaze falling to the ground. "One day it just seemed like all the others started moving in, and things just changed." He shook his head, a hint of sadness in his voice. "I suppose I just wanted to hold on to the way things used to be." The Wilsons exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of understanding and empathy. They knew all too well the fear and discomfort that came with change, and they could see how Mr. Hollister's bygone nostalgia had morphed into a hardened resistance to progress. "Mr. Hollister," William said softly, "I know change can be scary, but it doesn't have to be a bad thing. This neighborhood has evolved over the years, but that doesn't mean we can't all still live together, support one another, and create a vibrant, inclusive community." He paused, his gaze locking with the older man's. "What do you say we give it a try?" Mr. Hollister's lips pressed into a thin line as he contemplated William's words. The tension in the air was palpable, and the Wilsons held their breath, waiting to see how their stubborn neighbor would respond. Would he finally be willing to let go of his preconceptions and embrace the diversity that had once defined this community? Or would his fear and resentment continue to keep him at odds with his neighbors? The outcome of this encounter would not only shape the future of the Wilson family's summer barbecue, but also the very fabric of the neighborhood they called home. The stakes were high, and the path forward remained uncertain, leaving everyone to wonder what twist of fate might unfold next. The air was thick with anticipation as Mr. Hollister considered William Wilson's words. For the first time in years, the older man found himself grappling with a lifetime of preconceptions and prejudices that had shaped his view of the neighborhood he had once cherished. In the silence that followed, the Wilsons could practically hear the cogs turning in Mr. Hollister's mind. They knew this moment was pivotal, a crossroads that could either lead to a newfound understanding or a continued clash of wills. Finally, Mr. Hollister let out a long, weary sigh. "I suppose," he began, his voice tinged with uncertainty, "that I haven't exactly been the most welcoming neighbor, have I?" He cast a sheepish glance toward the Wilson family, their faces filled with a mix of hope and caution. "All these years, I've been clinging to the way things used to be," Mr. Hollister continued, his gaze falling to the photograph still clutched in his hands. "I guess I was too afraid to see that the world keeps moving forward, whether I like it or not." He paused, his weathered features softening ever so slightly. "And in the process, I may have pushed away the very people who could have helped me see that change doesn't have to be a bad thing." The Wilsons listened intently, scarcely daring to breathe. They had witnessed a profound shift in their neighbor's demeanor, a crack in the armor of his staunch resistance. Could this be the opening they needed to bridge the divide and forge a path toward reconciliation? "Mr. Hollister," William said, his voice low and measured, "I understand how difficult it can be to let go of the past. But I truly believe that if we work together, we can create something even better than what came before." He extended a hand, a gesture of goodwill and kinship. "What do you say we start over, as neighbors, and maybe even as friends?" The tension in the air was palpable as Mr. Hollister stared at William's outstretched hand. The Wilsons held their collective breath, their hearts racing with anticipation. This moment would be the true test of whether their neighbors' hardened prejudices could be softened, or if the divide between them was too deep to overcome. Seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity, as Mr. Hollister's gaze shifted from the photograph to William's face. The children, sensing the gravity of the situation, remained silent, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. And then, in a moment that seemed to slow time itself, Mr. Hollister slowly, hesitantly, reached out and grasped William's hand. His expression was one of uncertainty, but also a glimmer of something that resembled understanding. I suppose we could give it a try," the older man murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. for the sake of the neighborhood and for the sake of the past. The Wilsons erupted in a collective sigh of relief, their faces breaking into tentative smiles. The tension that had gripped the scene just moments ago had not entirely dissipated, but a spark of hope had ignited, promising the possibility of a new beginning. Yet, as the two men shook hands, both knew that the true test lay ahead. The path to reconciliation and community would be a long and arduous one, fraught with challenges and setbacks. But in that moment, they had taken the first crucial step, and the future of the neighborhood hung in the balance. As the handshake between William Wilson and Mr. Hollister ended, a sense of cautious optimism filled the air. The Wilsons dared to hope that this moment of connection might mark the beginning of a new era of understanding and community in the neighborhood. However, their fragile hopes were soon shattered as a new figure emerged from the shadows, Mr. Hollister's nephew, a young man named Jacob, who had been watching the exchange with barely contained fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Uncle?" Jacob spat, his eyes narrowed in accusation as he strode toward the group. "I thought we agreed to put an end to this invasion of our neighborhood." The Wilsons instinctively drew closer together, their expressions shifting from hopeful to apprehensive. William tried to interject, to reason with the younger man, but Jacob raised a hand, silencing him with a dismissive glare. "No, I won't hear it," Jacob growled, his gaze shifting between his uncle and the Wilson family. "You can't just welcome these outsiders with open arms. They don't belong here, and we're going to make sure they understand that." Mr. Hollister, who had moments ago shown a glimmer of understanding, now seemed to shrink under his nephew's harsh words. The elderly man's brow furrowed, and a flash of uncertainty crossed his weathered features. "Jacob, please," Mr. Hollister implored, his voice wavering. "I think we should give them a chance. This neighborhood used to be a place where people of all backgrounds coaled. That was then, and this is now." Jacob interrupted, his tone laced with contempt. "Things have changed, and it's time we took back what's ours." He turned his attention to the Wilsons, his lips curling into a menacing sneer. "You people have no place here. If you know what's good for you, you'll pack up and leave before we make you." The air crackled with tension as the Wilsons stood their ground, their expressions a mix of fear, defiance, and determination. William stepped forward, his jaw set, ready to defend his family and their right to belong in this community. "Now you listen here, young man," William began, his voice firm and resolute. "This is our home, and we have every right to be here, just like you. We're not going anywhere, and we won't be intimidated by your threats." Jacob's face contorted with rage, and for a moment it seemed as though he might lash out physically. But just as the situation threatened to escalate into a full-blown confrontation, a new player emerged from the Wilson family's backyard, a figure whose very presence would change the course of the conflict forever. As the Wilsons and the Hollisters turned their attention to this unexpected newcomer, a hush fell over the scene. What secrets did this individual hold, and how would their arrival alter the delicate balance that had been struck between the two families? The tension mounted, the stakes rising with every passing moment, as the stage was set for a climactic showdown that would reverberate throughout the neighborhood. As the new figure emerged from the Wilson family's backyard, a hush fell over the tense gathering. All eyes turned to this unexpected arrival, whose identity and purpose remained shrouded in mystery. The Wilsons watched with bated breath, while the Hollisters, both uncle and nephew, regarded the newcomer with a mix of confusion and apprehension. It was Mr. Hollister who finally found his voice, his weathered features etched with a hint of recognition. "Sarah?" he breathed, his eyes widening in surprise. "Is that really you?" The woman, whose gentle features belied an inner strength, nodded slowly. "Hello, Father," she replied, her voice soft yet unwavering. "It's been a long time." The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the gathered crowd. The Wilsons exchanged puzzled glances, while Jacob Hollister's face contorted with a mix of confusion and resentment. "Father?" he spat, his gaze darting between the woman and his uncle. "What is the meaning of this?" Mr. Hollister raised a trembling hand, his eyes never leaving the woman's face. "Sarah, my daughter," he murmured, the weight of those words seeming to settle heavily upon his shoulders. I I never thought I'd see you again." The Wilsons watched the unfolding drama with a mixture of fascination and trepidation. They sensed that this revelation held the key to unlocking the deep-seated tensions and prejudices that had divided the neighborhood for so long. Sarah Hollister stepped forward, her expression calm and resolute. "I'm here, Father, because it's time we faced the truth about our family's past and the role we've played in shaping this community." Jacob Hollister's face flushed with anger, his fists clenching at his sides. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "This is our neighborhood, and we're not going to let some outsiders come in and—" "Enough, Jacob," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm. "It's time you learned the truth about our family's history, about the choices your grandfather made, and the damage they caused." As Sarah's words hung in the air, the Wilsons watched in rapt attention, their own personal history now interwoven with the Hollisters in ways they could scarcely have imagined. The stage was set for a revelation that would shake the very foundations of the neighborhood and potentially transform the lives of all who called it home. The tension reached a crescendo as Sarah Hollister prepared to unveil the secrets of the past, secrets that had long been buried but now threatened to upend the fragile balance of the present. The Wilsons braced themselves, their hearts pounding with anticipation and dread, as they awaited the climactic moment that would decide the fate of their community. The air was thick with anticipation as Sarah Hollister prepared to unveil the secrets of her family's past. All eyes were fixed on the woman, waiting with bated breath to learn the truth that had the power to transform the very fabric of their community. "You see," Sarah began, her gaze sweeping across the Wilsons and her father and nephew, "our family was once instrumental in shaping this neighborhood, but not in the way you might think, Jacob." Jacob Hollister's brow furrowed in confusion, his defiant stance wavering ever so slightly. "Back in the 1960s, when this community was a thriving, diverse neighborhood," Sarah continued, "my grandfather was one of the key figures behind a series of discriminatory housing policies that effectively pushed out families of color." She paused, her expression grave. "He used his influence and wealth to ensure that this area remained predominantly white, even going so far as to prevent certain families from purchasing homes here." A collective gasp rippled through the Wilsons, their eyes widening in shock. Mr. Hollister, for his part, averted his gaze, his weathered features etched with shame. "It's true," the older man murmured, his voice laced with regret. "I was young and foolish back then, and I allowed myself to be swept up in my father's misguided crusade. I should have spoken up, should have tried to stop the harm he was causing, but I was too afraid to rock the boat." Jacob Hollister's expression morphed from one of defiance to disbelief. But this was our neighborhood," he stammered, his gaze darting between his uncle and his cousin. "We were just trying to protect what was ours." Sarah shook her head, her eyes filled with a profound sorrow. "No, Jacob, this was never just ours to protect. This was a community, a place where people of all backgrounds should have been welcome to live and thrive." She paused, her voice softening. "And by trying to keep it that way, we ended up destroying the very thing that made it special." The Wilsons listened, their hearts heavy with the weight of this revelation. They had always known that the neighborhood had changed over the decades, but the depth of the Hollisters' involvement in that transformation was a sobering realization. "I spent years running from this truth," Sarah confessed, her gaze locking with her father's. "But when I saw what was happening here, I knew I couldn't remain silent any longer. It's time for our family to make amends, to help rebuild the community we once tried to tear apart." Mr. Hollister nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're right, Sarah. It's time." He turned to the Wilsons, his expression etched with sincerity. "I'm so sorry for everything. I can't undo the harm my family has caused, but I want to do whatever I can to make things right." William Wilson stepped forward, his hand extended in a gesture of forgiveness. "We understand, Mr. Hollister. The past can't be changed, but together we can work to create a better future for this neighborhood, one that celebrates diversity and brings people together, just as it once did." As the two men shook hands, a sense of hope and renewal filled the air. The Wilsons and the Hollisters, once divided by prejudice and fear, now stood united in their commitment to healing the wounds of the past and building a more inclusive, vibrant community. In the days and weeks that followed, the neighborhood witnessed a remarkable transformation. The Hollisters, led by Sarah's unwavering determination, worked tirelessly to make amends and support initiatives that promoted diversity and understanding. Slowly but surely, the barriers that had once divided the community began to crumble, and new bonds of friendship and trust began to form. The Wilson family's backyard barbecue, which had sparked the initial confrontation, became a regular gathering spot for the entire neighborhood. Laughter, music, and the aroma of delicious food filled the air as people of all backgrounds came together to celebrate their shared humanity. And as the summer sun set over the once divided community, the Wilsons and the Hollisters, now united in their quest for reconciliation, knew that the journey ahead would be a long and challenging one. But they also knew that by facing the past head-on and embracing the richness of their diversity, they had taken the first crucial steps toward building a future where everyone belonged.